The flyer was printed on cheap paper, the kind that buckles slightly at the corners when it's been exposed to humidity for too long. It was stapled to a wooden utility pole at the edge of a gas station parking lot, half covered by older notices that had faded into illegibility. Yard sales, tutoring, a lost dog from 2 months ago. This one was newer. The ink hadn't bled yet. Missing person. Below it, a photo. A man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. Neutral expression, direct eye contact with the camera. Not smiling, not frowning. The kind of photo you'd pick because it looked like the person on an average day. There was something about that detail that held my attention longer than it should have. His name was Daniel Krev. Last seen 4 days ago near Black Ridge County, just off an access road that didn't have a proper name. Only a route number I didn't recognize. There was a phone number listed, and beneath that, in smaller text that looked like it had been added later, "If found near the bunker, do not enter. Call immediately." I read that line twice. It wasn't the kind of warning you usually see on missing person flyers. Those tend to be straightforward. Last seen wearing this, contact this number, please help. This one felt specific, like whoever printed it knew exactly where he had gone. I glanced toward the convenience store behind me. A couple of people moved in and out. Normal morning traffic. Someone laughed. A car door slammed. Everything about the environment said this was just another place, another day. The flyer didn't match that. I took a photo of it with my phone. I don't usually involve myself in things like that. I noticed it, sure, but noticing and acting are different. I went inside, bought coffee I didn't need, and stood by the window for a minute longer than necessary, looking back at the pole. The phrase stayed with me. If found near the bunker, do not enter. Not dangerous area, not unstable structure, just don't enter. As if entering was the mistake that mattered most. Back in my car, I opened the photo and zoomed in on the route number. It was partially obscured by a crease in the paper, but I could make out enough of it to search. The map took a second to load, then settled on a stretch of road about 40 minutes outside town. Black Ridge County. I hesitated there, thumb hovering over the screen. It would have been easy to close the app, start the engine, and forget about it within the hour. That's what I should have done. There wasn't any real reason for me to get involved. Instead, I checked the time, took a sip of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, and started the car. The drive out was uneventful in the way that makes time feel compressed. 1 minute I was merging onto the highway. The next I was turning onto a narrower road, lined with dense trees that blocked out most of the sky. The signal dropped about 10 minutes in. Not completely, but enough that streaming anything would have been unreliable. The route number matched. I slowed as the pavement gave way to a rougher surface, gravel scattered unevenly across packed dirt. There weren't any signs indicating restricted access, no gates, nothing to suggest I wasn't supposed to be there, which in hindsight felt deliberate. About half a mile down, I saw the first indication that I had the right place. Another flyer, identical to the one at the gas station, stapled to a tree at eye level. This one was less intact, the bottom edge torn slightly, but the warning was still readable. If found near the bunker, do not enter. Someone had written something underneath it in pen. Too late. The handwriting was uneven, pressed hard enough into the paper that it had torn in a few places along the strokes. Not careful, not casual either. It looked like it had been done quickly, with more force than necessary. I got out of the car. The air was cooler than I expected, shaded by the trees, and carrying that damp, metallic scent you get near old structures or standing water. It wasn't strong, just noticeable enough to register. I looked around, half expecting to see something obvious, a building, a sign, anything that marked the bunker's location. There was nothing like that, just trees, undergrowth, and the narrow continuation of the road ahead. I checked my phone again. The map still showed the route extending another quarter-mile before ending abruptly. No labels beyond that point. No points of interest. I told myself I'd just go a little further. Confirm the location. Maybe take a look from a distance. That was reasonable. That didn't cross any lines. I got back in the car and kept going. The road narrowed as I went, branches encroaching from both sides, brushing lightly against the doors, with a sound that was easy to ignore if you didn't focus on it. The ground became more uneven. I had to slow to avoid scraping the undercarriage. Then the trees opened up. Not into a clearing exactly, more like a break in the density, where the ground sloped slightly downward, and the vegetation thinned enough to reveal what was underneath. Concrete. At first, it looked like just another slab, the kind you might find as a foundation for something that had been removed years ago. But as I pulled closer, the shape became clearer. It wasn't flat. It was angled, partially embedded into the earth, with a set of thick, rusted metal doors set into the incline. One of them was slightly ajar. The bunker. I parked about 20 feet away and turned off the engine. The sudden absence of sound made everything else more noticeable. The wind moving through the trees, the faint creak of metal shifting somewhere ahead. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, looking at the door. It wasn't wide open. Just enough space for a person to slip through if they turned sideways. The edges were worn, the paint long gone, leaving exposed metal that had oxidized into a dull, uneven brown. There were markings on the concrete beside it, faded stenciling, mostly illegible, but I could make out a few words. Authorized personnel. Below that, something else, too worn to read clearly. I thought about the flyer, about the added line, the warning. If found near the bunker, do not enter. I should have stopped there. Instead, I reached for my flashlight, opened the car door, and stepped out. The ground felt softer than it looked, a thin layer of dirt and decayed leaves, giving slightly under each step as I moved toward the entrance. Up close, the bunker door was larger than it had appeared from the car, easily 8 feet tall, built from thick steel that had warped just enough over time to prevent it from sealing cleanly. The gap between the doors was uneven, wider at the top than the bottom, as if something had shifted in the frame years ago and never been corrected. I stopped just short of the threshold. There's a moment, in situations like that, where your brain runs through a compressed series of checks. Environment, risk, exit points. It's not fear exactly, more like an internal calibration. I listened for anything that didn't belong. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a sound from inside, not distinct enough to identify. It could have been air moving through the structure, or something settling. It didn't repeat in a way that suggested intent. I told myself that mattered. I angled the flashlight through the opening. The beam cut into the darkness and stopped against a concrete wall about 10 feet in, revealing a narrow entry corridor that sloped downward at a shallow angle. Dust coated everything in a uniform layer, undisturbed except for a faint break near the center. A path. Not clean footprints, not sharply defined, but enough disruption to suggest recent movement. Something had gone in, or out. I stayed where I was and looked back over my shoulder toward the car. It was still there, visible through the trees, exactly where I had left it. The distance between me and it felt longer than 20 feet. I turned back to the entrance. Just a look, I said out loud, the sound of my own voice flattening against the open air and disappearing quickly. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, a noticeable shift that settled against my skin as I cleared the doorway. The air had that sealed quality I'd noticed earlier, stronger now, mixed with something metallic that lingered at the back of my throat. Behind me, the door moved, a low scrape of metal against concrete. I turned instinctively, heart rate spiking just enough to register. The door had shifted inward by an inch, maybe two, Not enough to change the opening in any meaningful way. Pressure difference, I thought. Air displacement. I watched it for a few seconds. It didn't move again. The corridor angled down for about 20 feet before leveling out into a short landing. The walls were poured concrete, rough in texture, with old conduit running along the ceiling in parallel lines. Some of the fixtures had come loose, hanging slightly lower than intended, but nothing looked like it was at immediate risk of collapse. My footsteps sounded wrong, muted, but not in the way I expected. The sound didn't echo back, it just stopped, as if the space absorbed it instead of reflecting it. It made it harder to judge distance, harder to place myself within the structure. At the bottom of the slope, the corridor opened into a wider hallway. Doors lined both sides, most of them ajar. Offices, I thought. Or storage rooms. The layout was familiar in a generic way, like something I'd seen before in a different context. I moved slowly, keeping the flashlight beam steady as I checked the nearest room on the right. Metal desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets along the back wall, papers scattered across the floor, fused together in places where moisture had gotten to them and then dried again. Nothing looked recently disturbed. The dust told the story. Every surface was coated evenly, the kind of accumulation that only happens when a place has been left alone for a long time. Except for the floor just inside the doorway. There the dust was broken. Not completely cleared, but disrupted in a pattern that didn't match random movement. It was directional, leading deeper into the building. I stepped back into a hallway. The same pattern continued down the center, subtle but consistent. A path worn through neglect rather than use. "Danwell," I said quietly, testing the name in the space. No response. I moved further in. The second room on the left was smaller, more like a utility space. Shelving units lined the walls, most of them empty. A few boxes remained, their contents either removed or decayed beyond recognition. One had collapsed inward, leaving a spill of dark material on the floor that I chose not to examine too closely. The third room was different. The door was closed. Not fully, there was a slight gap between it and the frame, but enough to stand out against the others. The handle was intact, metal dulled but functional. No visible damage. I hesitated, then reached out and pushed it open. It resisted slightly before giving way. Inside, the air felt heavier. Not colder, not warmer, just denser. The flashlight beam caught on something reflective near the far wall, and I adjusted my angle to get a better look. A mirror. It was mounted at about chest height, rectangular, edges chipped. The surface was cloudy with age, but still reflective enough to show movement. My movement. I stepped in, the floor creaking faintly under my weight. The dust here was different. Disturbed more heavily, concentrated in a rough circle directly in front of the mirror, as if someone had stood there for an extended period of time. I moved closer. My reflection resolved in fragments, the imperfections in the glass breaking it into slightly misaligned sections. For a second, it looked like I was standing at a wrong angle, like my posture didn't quite match what I felt. I adjusted my stance. The reflection followed, but a fraction of a second too late. I froze. It corrected itself immediately after, snapping back into alignment so cleanly that I couldn't be sure it had been off at all. The kind of thing that could be explained by lighting, by angle, by the surface itself. I leaned in slightly. The version of me in the mirror did the same. Exactly the same. I stayed there for another few seconds, watching for any delay, any inconsistency. Nothing. Just my own reflection, distorted by age. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. "Old glass," I said quietly, more for the sound than the explanation. Something moved behind me. Not in the room, in the hallway. I turned quickly, the flashlight beam snapping toward the doorway. The hall was empty, but the dust pattern had changed. Where it had been a single faint path before, there was now a second disturbance crossing it at an angle. Fresher, more defined. It hadn't been there when I walked in. I stepped back into the hallway, scanning both directions. Nothing. No movement. Just the two intersecting paths in the dust, one leading deeper into the bunker. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to decide if what I was seeing had a simple explanation I was missing. Dust doesn't shift on its own. Not like that. Not in a defined pattern, not without something causing it. Air movement might disturb a surface layer, but it wouldn't create direction, wouldn't leave a path that intersected another with that kind of clarity. Which meant something had moved through the hallway. Recently. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight beam back toward the direction I'd come from. The corridor stretched out exactly as I remembered it. Open doors, undisturbed rooms, the same quiet that absorbed sound instead of carrying it. Nothing there. I pivoted back toward the deeper section of the bunker. The second path led that way. There's a point where hesitation stops being useful. Standing still wasn't going to give me more information. If anything, it made me more aware of the silence, more aware of how little I could actually perceive about the space around me. So I followed it. The hallway extended another 40 or 50 feet before opening into a larger area. The ceiling rose slightly here, maybe a foot or two higher, and the walls showed more signs of reinforcement. Thicker concrete, additional support beams set at regular intervals. A junction. 3 corridors branched off from the main one, each identical in width and construction. No signage, no markings to indicate their purpose. Just 3 options and no clear reason to choose one over the others. Except for the floor. The disturbed dust continued straight ahead. The other 2 corridors remained untouched, their surfaces smooth and uniform. I kept moving. The air grew heavier the further I went, not enough to make breathing difficult, but noticeable in the way it settled in my chest. There was a smell now, too. Faint, but distinct. Organic. Not decay exactly, something adjacent to it. Like damp material that hadn't fully broken down. The flashlight flickered once. A quick stutter, barely half a second, but enough to tighten something in my chest. I tapped the side of it instinctively. The beam steadied. "Battery's fine," I said under my breath. The words sounded smaller here. The corridor narrowed slightly, the walls pressing in just enough that I became more aware of my shoulders, of the space I occupied within it. The conduit along the ceiling grew denser, bundled cables running in parallel lines that disappeared into the darkness ahead. About halfway down, I saw the first clear footprint. Not just a disturbance in dust, but an actual impression. Boot tread. I crouched, angling the light for a better look. The pattern was sharp enough to make out individual grooves, the edges still defined. Recent. Within hours, maybe less. It wasn't mine. I hadn't stepped there yet. I placed my own boot beside it for comparison. Different tread, different size. "Daniel," I said again, quieter this time. The name felt less like a call and more like a confirmation. He had been here. I straightened and continued forward, my pace slower now, more deliberate. The single set of footprints became 2, then 3, overlapping in places, as if whoever made them had moved back and forth along this stretch more than once. Indecision. Or repetition. The corridor ended in a door. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced. Thicker metal, a wheel-style locking mechanism mounted at chest height, the kind you see in older industrial or military installations. It was partially open, the wheel turned just enough to disengage whatever internal bolts had once secured it. The gap was wider than the bunker entrance. I could walk through without turning sideways. I stopped just outside it. The smell was stronger here. And there was another scent, layered underneath it now. Metallic, sharper than before. Blood. I didn't need to see it yet to know that's what it was. I pushed the door open further. The hinges protested with a low grinding sound that seemed louder than it should have been. echoing just enough to suggest a larger space beyond. The room inside was significantly bigger than anything I'd seen so far. Rectangular, high ceiling, walls lined with equipment that had long since been stripped of anything useful, leaving behind empty frames and mounting brackets. The floor was concrete, but it wasn't smooth. It was marked. Dark stains spread across it in irregular patterns, some pooled, others dragged into long streaks that led toward the far side of the room, toward the center. That's where I saw him. At first it didn't register as a person. The shape was wrong, elevated off the ground, suspended at an angle that didn't align with any natural posture. My brain tried to categorize it as debris, as part of the structure, anything that didn't require immediate understanding. Then the light settled, and the details aligned. A man, held in place by strands of something that stretched from wall to wall, floor to ceiling. Not rope, not wire. Thicker in some places, thinner in others, with a texture that caught the light in a way that suggested moisture. Webbing. The word came uninvited, but it fit. He was wrapped in it, not randomly, but deliberately. The strands crossed his torso, pinned his arms, anchored his legs. His head tilted forward slightly, chin resting near his chest. Daniel? The name felt fragile in the space. For a second, nothing happened. Then his fingers twitched. Small movement, but unmistakable. I took a step forward, careful to avoid the darker stains on the floor. Daniel, can you hear me? His head shifted. Slowly, like the motion had to pass through resistance before it could complete. His face turned just enough for the light to catch his eyes. They were open, and they were focused. Not on the room, on me. Relief hit first. He was alive. Then something else followed it, quieter, but more persistent. Wrong. There was something wrong with the way he was looking at me. Not fear, not confusion, recognition maybe, but distorted, like he was seeing me through something else. His mouth opened. The sound that came out wasn't a word. It was a wet, uneven exhale that broke halfway through, reshaped itself and tried again. The effort was visible in the tension of his jaw, in the way his throat moved. Don't, he managed, the word collapsing at the end. Don't what? I stepped closer, raising the light to get a better look at the webbing. I can get you out. Just stay still. That wasn't good advice. He started shaking his head immediately, the movement jerky, constrained by whatever held him in place. No, he forced out, louder this time, though it cost him. No, you can't. The webbing moved. Not much, just a slight shift in tension, like something had adjusted its grip somewhere above him. I froze. Did you feel that? I asked, the question automatic. His eyes widened. Run. The word came out clean, clear, and absolute. The sound that followed didn't come from him. The sound was subtle at first, easy to mistake for the building settling or the faint movement of air through the upper structure. A soft, irregular tapping, spaced unevenly, like something making contact with a hard surface and then pausing before doing it again. Then it repeated, closer, not louder exactly, just clearer, as if whatever was making it had shifted into a position where the sound carried more directly down into the room. I tilted the flashlight upward. The beam didn't reach the ceiling cleanly. It scattered across suspended strands of the same material that held Daniel in place, revealing layers I hadn't noticed before. The webbing wasn't confined to the center of the room. It extended outward, connecting to the walls, the equipment frames, and something higher up that the light couldn't fully resolve. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a different sound replaced it, a slow, wet drag, like something repositioning itself. Daniel's breathing changed. The shallow, uneven rhythm shifted into something sharper, more urgent. It's here, he said, the words barely holding together. It doesn't like movement. That didn't track with what I was hearing. The thing above us was moving. I took a step back instead of forward, recalibrating distance, line of sight, exits. The door was still behind me, open, unobstructed. I'm going to... The webbing trembled. Not just around him. The entire structure reacted, a ripple passing through it from the upper right corner of the room, down toward where he was suspended. The strands tightened, then relaxed slightly, like a system adjusting tension across multiple anchor points. Daniel gasped. The sound that came out of him wasn't entirely voluntary. "Don't stop," he said, and I realized too late what he meant. I had frozen. The flashlight beam held steady on him, my body locked in place as I tried to process too many variables at once. Above us, something shifted again. Faster this time. The beam caught it for a fraction of a second as it moved between anchor points. Limbs. That was the first detail that made sense. Multiple limbs, jointed at sharp angles, repositioning with a kind of mechanical precision that didn't match any animal I could immediately name. They moved independently, but in coordination, distributing weight across the webbing in a way that minimized vibration. It stopped just outside the direct path of the light. I couldn't see it fully, but I knew where it was. "Back up," Daniel whispered. Slowly. I listened. One step, then another, careful to place my feet in the clearer sections of the floor, avoiding anything that might produce unnecessary sound. The instinct to turn and run was there, immediate and overwhelming, but I pushed it down. Fast movement felt wrong here, provocative. The door grew closer behind me. 10 feet. 8. 6. The thing above us adjusted again, tracking. Not reacting randomly. Tracking me. The realization settled in with a kind of cold clarity. It knew where I was. The beam flickered. Just once. But this time, it didn't come back immediately. For half a second, maybe less, the room dropped into complete darkness. And in that gap, something moved. Not above. Closer. The light snapped back on. It was between me and Daniel now. I hadn't seen it cross the space. One moment the path was clear, the next it wasn't. It occupied the air like a shape my brain didn't want to resolve all at once. Too many angles. Too many points of articulation. The body mass hummed slightly lower than I expected, supported by limbs that anchored into the webbing and the wall simultaneously. It turned. Not with a smooth rotation, but in segments, each part of it adjusting in sequence until the front, if it could be called that, faced me. The face was wrong. Not because it wasn't human, because it was. Set into a structure that had no right to contain it. Stretched across a surface that didn't match the proportions underneath. The skin pulled tight in some areas, slack in others, as if it had been fitted over something that didn't align with it properly. The eyes moved first, independently, finding me. The mouth followed, opening slightly, the motion slow and deliberate. A sound came out. Low, wet, layered. Not quite speech, but close enough that my brain tried to interpret it anyway. I took another step back. My heel hit the threshold of the door. The creature reacted, not with speed, but with tension. The webbing tightened around it, the strands pulling taut, as if responding to a signal I couldn't perceive. The limbs shifted, redistributing weight, preparing for something. "Go," Daniel said, louder now, the word breaking at the edges. Now. That was enough. I turned. The transition from controlled movement to full speed was immediate and disorienting. My body committed before my mind caught up, momentum carrying me through the doorway and into the corridor beyond. The sound behind me changed, no longer subtle, no longer controlled. It came all at once, a cascade of impacts, as the thing moved through the webbing and onto the concrete. abandoning whatever restraint it had maintained up to that point. I didn't look back. The corridor stretched ahead, the same narrow path I'd followed in, now compressed by urgency into something shorter, tighter, more difficult to navigate. My footsteps were loud, too loud. Each one seemed to echo now, the sound no longer absorbed, but thrown back at me in sharp bursts that made it harder to track anything else. Behind me, it followed, not with a steady rhythm, but with overlapping patterns of movement. Multiple points of contact hitting the ground, the walls, the ceiling. It didn't choose one surface. It used all of them. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The beam caught fragments, limbs adjusting mid-motion, the body shifting orientation without slowing. The face, I snapped the light forward again before I could process that part. The junction came into view, 3 corridors. I didn't slow. I took the center path, following the disturbed dust without thinking, trusting the route I'd already mapped in my head. The flashlight flickered again, longer this time. 1, 2. Darkness stretched between pulses of light, breaking my sense of continuity into fragments. I ran through it anyway. The offices appeared on either side, doors still open, rooms unchanged, as if nothing had happened here at all. My shoulder clipped a doorframe. Pain flared, sharp but manageable. I kept moving. The exit slope was ahead. Light, real light, filtered faintly through the partially open bunker door, a gray wash that marked the boundary between inside and out. Behind me, the sound shifted again. Closer. I hit the incline at speed, my footing less stable on the angled surface. My hand went to the wall instinctively, using it to steady myself as I pushed upward. The door loomed, half open, unchanged. I reached it and didn't slow, turning sideways just enough to clear the gap without losing momentum. Outside air hit me hard. Open. Normal. I stumbled forward onto the uneven ground, taking several steps before stopping, turning instinctively to look back at the entrance. The door moved. Slowly. Inward. Not closing fully. Just enough to narrow the gap. And then it stopped. The darkness beyond it remained still. I didn't wait to see if it would move again. The distance between me and the car felt longer on the way back, stretched by adrenaline and the awareness that whatever had been inside that bunker was no longer contained by the idea of it. My steps were uneven at first, my body still adjusting to open space after the compression of the corridor. The ground caught at my shoes, loose dirt and roots threatening to pull me off balance if I didn't watch where I placed my feet. I forced myself to slow down, not stop, just enough to keep control. Running blindly now felt like a different kind of risk. When I reached the car, my hands were shaking harder than I expected. It took 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine turning over was louder than it should have been, the sound cutting through the quiet in a way that made me glance back toward the bunker again. The door hadn't moved, still slightly open, still dark. I pulled out too fast, the tires slipping briefly before catching the uneven ground. The narrow road back felt tighter than before, the trees closer, the branches louder against the sides of the car. Every turn felt like it took longer than it should, like the road had stretched the same way the distance to the car had. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not at first. I kept my focus forward, on the path, on getting back to where the signal would return, where the world would start to feel structured again. The kind of place where things made sense by default. It took 10 minutes before I checked. The road behind me was empty. No movement between the trees. No shape following the path. Just the same narrow stretch of dirt and gravel disappearing into shadow. That should have been enough. It wasn't. By the time I reached the main road, my breathing had settled into something closer to normal, but the rest of me hadn't caught up. My hands still felt unsteady on the wheel, my thoughts moving too quickly, replaying fragments of what I'd seen, without settling on any one detail long enough to process it fully. The flyer, Daniel, the webbing, the face. I drove straight home. I don't remember most of the route back. The turns, the traffic, the transitions between roads, all of it blurred into a single continuous motion that ended with me pulling into my parking space and sitting there with the engine off, hands still on the wheel. The silence in the car was different from the silence in the bunker. This one was familiar, predictable. I stayed there for a while, letting that distinction settle in. Then I went inside. My apartment looked exactly the way I'd left it. Nothing out of place, nothing disturbed. The kind of normal that should have reset everything back to baseline. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, set my keys down in the same spot I always did. Routine helped. Small, repeatable actions that reinforced the idea that I was back somewhere controlled. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water and drank it too quickly. The second glass went slower. By the third, my hands had steadied enough that I could set it down without thinking about it. I told myself I was done. That whatever had happened out there stayed there. That I had made it out before anything could follow. That last part held for longer than it should have. It wasn't until I changed my shirt that I noticed it. A thin strand caught near the seam of my sleeve. Red. At first, I thought it was a thread, something from the fabric itself pulled loose. But the color was wrong. Too dark in some places, too translucent in others. It didn't sit on the surface the way a loose thread would. It adhered. I pinched it between my fingers and pulled gently. It stretched. Far more than it should have. The material thinned as it extended, maintaining its integrity instead of snapping the way anything normal would under that kind of tension. I stopped pulling. For a second, I just held it there, extended between my fingers and my sleeve, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with anything that made sense. Then I pulled harder. It resisted, then gave, separating with a soft, almost elastic recoil that snapped the end back toward my hand. The piece I held moved slightly, not on its own, but not entirely inert either. I dropped it. It landed on the floor and stayed there, still. I removed the shirt immediately, more carefully than necessary, making sure it didn't brush against anything else as I pulled it off. I carried it to the trash, hesitated, then changed direction, and shoved it into a plastic bag instead, sealing it tight before setting it near the door. Containment. The word came to me without context, but it felt appropriate. I washed my hands, twice, then a third time. The water ran clear. No residue. Nothing visible. That should have helped. It didn't. I moved through the apartment slowly after that, checking spaces without fully committing to the idea that I expected to find something. Bathroom, closet, the small utility area near the kitchen. All empty. All normal. By the time I sat down, the adrenaline had burned off enough to leave something else in its place. Exhaustion. The kind that settles deep, not just physical, but cognitive, like my brain had reached a limit and was starting to shut things down in stages. I didn't remember deciding to lie down. I just remember waking up. Dark room. Phone screen lit with missed notifications I didn't process. For a moment, I didn't move. I listened. The apartment had its usual sounds, faint traffic outside, pipes in the walls, someone moving in the unit above mine. Normal. Then, something else. Faint. From deeper inside the apartment. A wet, uneven sound. It came in a short burst, stopped, then came again. I sat up slowly. The direction was wrong. Not outside. Not through the walls. Inside, somewhere past the hallway. I stayed where I was, focusing on it, trying to isolate it from the rest of the ambient noise. It came again, longer this time, and underneath it, just barely, something with structure. Not random. not mechanical. A pattern. I stood up. Each step toward the doorway felt measured, deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with caution, and everything to do with not wanting to confirm what I already suspected. The hallway was dark. The sound came again. Closer now. Or clearer. I reached for the light switch. Paused. And in that pause I heard it shift. Not just the sound. Position. Closer to the edge of the hall. Waiting. I turned the light on. The hallway was empty, but the door to the bathroom was slightly open.